Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people. A regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics. Brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Park.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California today. And as always, I'm joined by...
This is Bob Bazanko in cold and snowy Ohio today.
Yep. And we are going to be talking about... on the show, you may have noticed that we are very, very big fans of talking about all types of foreign policy. And so today, we're going to actually be doing a bit of a deep dive into Canada's foreign policy. And to be doing that, we are joined by Pitasanna Shanmugathas, who is a I want to say documentary filmmaker, but docuseries maker based in Canada. And we're going to be talking about his documentary series called Truth to Powerlessness, an investigation into Canada's foreign policy. Welcome to Green and Red, Pitasanna.
Thank you for having me.
And we're gonna get into a little bit of the background and details of your docuseries, but just to do a sort of like quick opening question, what do you think viewers and even listeners to this show are going to find most surprising about Canadian foreign policy that has emerged from your docuseries?
I think to individuals who have this image of Canada as being this benevolent, peaceful country that we're all about peace and preserving. Going into countries, deploying our peacekeepers to restore, some sense of order. I think if that's the image that people have going into this docuseries, then I think they're going to be very surprised when they find out in watching this docuseries that Canada has been involved in overthrowing democratic governments in different parts of the world. Canada has been involved in selling, weapons to nations with horrendous human rights records. Canada has been involved in mining atrocities in Latin America and in Africa, and Canada has been our pension plan, the Canadian pension plan. The Canadian government invests Canadian citizens' pensions into some of the most rapacious and some of the most capitalistic intensive corporations like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, oil corporations, just some of the most disgusting corporations you can think of for profit. So I mean, a significant thread throughout this docuseries is the role that profit plays, the role that finance plays in Canada's foreign policy. And when you see that, I think that's quite eye-opening.
Yeah, Americans do have a pristine view of Canada. I think, for some legitimate reasons, guns and healthcare and things like that. But and they kind of, I think, transfer that into thinking, as you said, that it's this benevolent place. Your series has 6 parts to it, which deal with different aspects of Canadian foreign policy. If you want to just kind of tell us like how you came up with you don't have to talk about all 6, but how you came up with those different categories and what you think is important in them.
When we had first begun this docuseries, we wanted to look at Canada's foreign policy, really focusing mainly on the post-World War II era going forward. So we had this idea about doing like a broad scope documentary. So I should kind of talk about the influence behind in order to answer your question properly, I should talk about the influence that compelled me to actually do this docuseries, as I think that would better answer your question. I was born and raised in Toronto, went to school in Toronto, and I got my undergraduate education at the University of Toronto, which is it's considered like an Ivy League school, in Canada. It's one of the leading, it's consistently ranked as the top #1 school in Canada. So I did my undergraduate education in political science, and there you kind of learn, about like Lester B. Pearson, who was Canada's former prime minister, who was who had supposedly brought peacekeeping to the global world stage because of how he had diffused the Suez crisis and he had won a Nobel Peace Prize. And you're kind of taught that, but then you're not until in dispossessing Palestinians from their land and in imposing, the partition plan. You're not taught about how Lester B. Pearson was a strong supporter of the Vietnam War. You're not taught about any of that. So when I did my education at the University of Toronto, my undergraduate education, you get like the establishment knowledge. And then I did my graduate education at a foreign policy school called the Munk School of Global Affairs. The Munk School of Global Affairs is a graduate foreign policy school at the University of Toronto. But the Munk School, it's significantly, the main donor of the Munk School is a man by the name of Peter Munk, who is the founder of Barrick Gold. And Barrick Gold is one of the largest gold mining companies in the world. So Barrick Gold's mining companies have committed horrendous atrocities in Latin America. Barrick Gold hired security forces, have raped villagers. Barrick Gold has dispossessed, villagers from their home, poisoned ecosystems. So horrendous atrocities. And this is the man, the founder of Barrick Gold, who significantly funded the Munk School, of which I am a graduate of. So my education is a very establishment kind of education. So what then compelled me to make this docuseries, which very much challenges the establishment narrative. So during my studies, I had stumbled upon on my social media feed. One day I was just sitting, waiting at the airport. I was scrolling through my social media feed. I come across an article which says the myth of Lester B. Pearson. And so I just curiosity, I click on it. And it talks about how Lester B. Pearson was a supporter of the Vietnam War and how he was instrumental in dispossessing Palestinians from their land and imposing this partition plan. And so it's, and it just kind of blowed my mind. It was by a writer by the name of Yves Engler, who's a strong critic of Canada's foreign policy. He's been dubbed the Canadian Noam Chomsky. So that was like a revelation to me. And then I stumbled upon his works. He had written a critical book called The Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy, which is like a collection of just Canada's atrocities they've committed all over the world, overthrowing democracies, supporting fascism, mining atrocities, selling weapons to horrendous human rights abusing nations, just all these kind of atrocities I can think of. It's a significant work. And when I read that book, it just kind of blew my mind right open. And so when I was going to your question, when I was thinking about how I should go about this docuseries, I'd kind of fleshed it out using the material, the material that Yves Engler had significantly investigated, looking at Canada's support for fascism during World War II. That's the first episode. It kind of deals with Canada's support for fascism during World War II, and it deals with Canada emerging out of World War II as a significant power, as one of like the fourth largest power in many respects in terms of our Navy and Canada's military. So it talks about Canada's role in NATO, how Canada's prime minister at the time was a significant advocate of this North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it talks about how Canada within NATO was supporting, oppressing independence movements that were happening in the developing world. And that's the first episode. And then we kind of get into the role of finance. We devote an entire episode to that. And through that episode, we talk about all these different issues. Like we talk about Canada's support for Saudi Arabia during their intervention and atrocity in Yemen, and we talk about East Timor. And throughout the entire docuseries, it's important to point out that we interview the politicians as the politicians responsible, Canadian politicians responsible for formulating and advocating Canada's foreign policy and drafting Canada's foreign policy, we get the establishment line. So when we're interviewing, for instance, in episode 3, one of the main issues we wanted to touch upon was Israel-Palestine and just Canada's role in that, just because it's such a huge and relevant issue, and it will be for many more years to come. We wanted to interview Canadian politicians that were knowledgeable about this issue. So we interviewed Canada's ambassador to Israel during the Stephen Harper government. And we also interviewed the UN rapporteur on Palestine as well. So we interviewed we interviewed the politicians that were responsible for formulating and advocating Canada's foreign policy, as well as dissidents and academics challenging Canada's foreign policy. So you get both sides of every episode. You get both sides of every issue. So you get the establishment line, and you get individuals challenging that line. And
I'm kind of curious. Did you get any from the establishment, from the politicians? And I think there's a former Canadian defense minister that you interview. But I'm wondering if you got any sort of feedback about them being juxtaposed next to Chomsky and Eve Zingler and other dissidents, or if, since the docuseries has come out, have you heard from them?
So I've sent it to the politicians. I haven't heard. Unfortunately, when the docuseries was released, the defense minister that we interviewed, he had died about 2 days after. So and I was aware that he was in ill health at the time. So that's why I was so urgent that we had to interview him. And there's a very long and interesting story about that, which I hope I could get into. But to stay in terms of the topic of your question, when we sent it to the politicians, most of them actually did not respond. So some of them were like, "Oh, thank you for sending this," but there's no real response. We had interviewed James Bissett, who was Canada's ambassador to Yugoslavia. And we explore Canada's involvement in NATO. So we talk about Canada's involvement in Yugoslavia, Canada's involvement in Afghanistan, Canada's involvement in Libya, and we interview the relevant politicians that were responsible for Canada's interventions in all these different theaters of conflict. And so when we interviewed James Bissett, Canada's ambassador to Yugoslavia, he was a very rare breed in the sense that he was part of the establishment, but he broke away from the establishment. He became a dissident, and he was extremely critical of Canada's involvement in the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, to the point where he actually called Canada's prime minister at the time, Jean Chrétien, a war criminal. And so when I sent it to him, he was like, "Oh, this is great work, and this should be taught in high schools all across the country." So politicians that were kind of critical, they responded receptively. The establishment politicians, we didn't get any response from them at all.
You mentioned a couple kind of more specifics, but you said you talked about NATO, but you also talk about Canada's role in promoting and supporting apartheid in Iraq and Latin America. Do you want to just kind of talk a little, because again, we're dealing in the United States, and it sounds like Canada too, with really large misconceptions about the Canadian role in global politics.
Yeah, so I talk about Canada's role in supporting apartheid in Israel and South Africa. So in that episode, we interviewed. We start the common thread in that episode is Canada being this settler colonial country, and Israel being a settler colonial country, and South Africa being the settler colonial country. That's the bond that kind of is responsible for this support among these nations. Where in the segment about South Africa, we talk about how Linda Freeman, a Canadian historian who has written extensively about Canada's relationship with apartheid South Africa, she talks about how white minority South African officials came to Canada and they looked at what are called Canadian residential schools. And Canadian residential schools are schools where indigenous children were stripped away from their parents by the Canadian government, and they were forcibly housed, and they had Christianity imposed on them, and they had a Western education system imposed on them. Their language was wiped out. The indigenous children's language was wiped out. They couldn't speak their language. They couldn't speak their culture. They couldn't embrace their culture. They couldn't embrace their traditions. And this system, this residential school system, was in place in Canada until 1996, very recent. And so South African officials, they came to Canada, they saw a residential school system, and they used that as a model for building the apartheid state in South Africa so that they could subjugate the indigenous Black population. And so there you see that settler colonial connection, and it's kind of portrayed in Canada as Canada being opposed to apartheid South Africa, but because we had supported South Africa's expulsion from the Commonwealth, but that was a very strategic move because India had threatened to leave the Commonwealth if South Africa remained. So for the purposes of preserving the Commonwealth, Canada, for that one instance, came out and supported South Africa's expulsion. Meanwhile, Canada still had a free trade agreement with apartheid South Africa, was still selling weapons to apartheid South Africa. Canadian companies were still using Black South Africans as a cheap labor force because it was very profitable to do so. So this was right up until the 1980s that Canada was strongly supporting South Africa at international institutions. There was one instance where Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, had given South Africa, apartheid South Africa, the needed votes at the IMF so that South Africa can get a loan. So Canada was supporting apartheid South Africa throughout. And in the case of Israel, we speak with the Canada's ambassador to Israel. We speak with the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine. We speak with individuals that are very critical of Canadian activists like Dimitri Lascaris. We speak with Canadian politicians like Helene Leverdier. And in the case of Canada's support for Israel, it kind of begins significantly with Lester B. Pearson, Canada's so-called peacekeeping prime minister. He goes to the UN and he strongly embraces the partition plan. He is very instrumental in getting this partition plan, whereby the Jews at the time in Palestine, they constituted less than 10% of the population, but they wanted they got more than 50% of the land, which is insane. And so he kind of destroyed any form of binational solution that could have come about. And the indigenous, the Palestinians, the Arab nations were all opposed to this. They couldn't understand why white Western nations were trying to impose a solution to their problem. And so Canada supported partitioning Palestine and dispossessing the Palestinians. And the interesting thing about Canada, and we explore how at the United Nations, Canada consistently, right up to the present time, votes against resolutions that are critical of Israel's settlement building, votes against resolutions which over 100 countries routinely every single year support, that are calling for a two-state solution, along the pre-June 67 lines. And in the case of Canada's support for Israel, there's like a comparison that's made between apartheid South Africa and Israel. But in the case of what's going on with the Palestinians, it's actually much worse than what occurred in apartheid South Africa, because in the case of apartheid South Africa, the Black majority was very useful to the white minority, because the Black majority, they were a very good labor force, which Canadian companies invested in. In the case of the Palestinians, they're completely useless to Israel. They just want to get rid of them. They don't, so in that case, people have asserted it's actually been much worse than apartheid, the system that's going on in the occupied territories right now. So, and So that's kind of what we explore in that episode about apartheid.
One other question, Canada is a member of NATO, and NATO is very much like a US-led alliance. And I'm wondering if you could just actually touch on Canada's role within NATO, and then we'll probably get into a little bit of a bigger question about Canada's relationship with the US. But if you could maybe just start with their role within NATO.
So Canada, as a member of NATO, Canada was a founding member of NATO, and as a member of NATO, Canada during the Cold War was instrumental, as we discussed in the docuseries, and actually the first episode was instrumental in suppressing indigenous independence movements in the Congo, for instance. Was sending arms and supplying arms to suppress Patrice Lumumba. Canada actually played a role in assassinating Patrice Lumumba. The Democratic Republic of Congo, their first democratic leader was Patrice Lumumba, and he had called for the resources of the Congo, which is resource-wise, the Congo is the richest nation on the planet, still is today. And Patrice Lumumba had called for those resources to be used to benefit the people, the Black Congolese people, after they had been brutally subjugated by the Belgians. So Canada was very instrumental in his assassination. Canada, supported numerous movements to suppress independence movements. In terms of India, Canada said that India isn't ready to be an independent nation. In Algeria, Canada, through NATO, had supplied weapons to suppress the independence movement there. Canada also played a horrendous role in the Mau revolt. So that was the Cold War role of Canada and NATO. Getting out of the Cold War, Canada begins, their first notable intervention is in Yugoslavia in 1999, where Canada, there was a pretext that Milosevic was this notorious mass murderer, and he was murdering, Albanians, and we have to intervene in order to solve this. And after the end of the Cold War, there was this concern, this worry about what's going to happen, with NATO. Now that the Soviet Union has collapsed, there was an agreement made, which James Bissett mentions in the docuseries. There's an agreement made between Gorbachev and George H.W. Bush that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east in exchange for a unified Germany, which was an enormous concession on the part of Russia, given how Germany had devastated Russia in the world wars, in both world wars. So it was an enormous concession. But Clinton came into office and immediately violated that, and NATO would continue to expand. So the bombing of Yugoslavia had provided a significant purpose for NATO, a renewed purpose. So Canada had used its fighter jets to bomb bridges, bomb civilian infrastructure. We bombed a news outlet, a state-run news outlet that was reporting about the atrocities. So Canada committed these horrendous human rights abuses, violations of war, violations of the laws of war. And then after the Yugoslavia, the 1999 war, the 78-day bombing is finished, there's once again this question about, all right, what are we going to do with NATO? Then comes in 9/11, which we also discuss in our docuseries. So then there's a renewed purpose for NATO. The United States is attacked. So NATO's Article 5 is invoked, and the NATO members all come together and they decide to intervene in Afghanistan. And so we interview Bill Graham, who was Canada's Minister of Defense and Minister of Foreign Affairs, as well as briefly a leader of opposition in Canada, is a significantly powerful individual. And, you know, I knew him personally because he was also a professor of mine. So, and so we interviewed him, and we also interviewed the Minister of Defense, David Pratt, at the time as well. And we get their establishment line on Canada's involvement in the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, how we wanted to get bin Laden in Afghanistan, and we also wanted to build Afghanistan and give women education and, you know, promote human rights. So that was the establishment narrative. But we also then interview people like Noam Chomsky. We interview academics like Justin Pordor. We interview even a Canadian soldier that went into Afghanistan and during Canada's involvement in Kandahar, which was really Canada's most significant military operation since our involvement in the Korean War. So that was a significant military intervention on Canada's part. And basically what the episode on Canada's involvement in Afghanistan exposes is that Canada, through its military intervention, was imposing a form of terrorism that was inhibiting Canada's supposed goals of education and bringing about democracy or whatever, because you had Canada's Canada terrorizing the Afghanistan population through the deployment of its military and breaking down the doors of villagers, and then you had Canada trying to impose an education system and trying to bring in girls into the workforce, meanwhile not respecting the traditions of the villagers that were kind of averse to this westernized way of life. And we explore all these issues. And at one point, I kind of asked Bill Graham, the defense minister and the foreign affairs minister, Bill Graham, I asked him, given that tens of thousands of refugees were created as a result of partly as a result of Canada's intervention, thousands of people killed, was it a mistake for Canada to have intervened? And he kind of just pauses a little bit and he says, I don't know how to answer your question. And which that was the only kind of moment where he seemed to have kind of some regret. And then we go on to talk about Canada's involvement in Libya in the fifth episode, where we interview Lawrence Wilkerson, who was chief of staff to Colin Powell. And we also interview Scott Taylor as well, who was a former Canadian soldier and who was a critic of Canada's military interventions. And what they expose is how horrendous it was for Canada and the West to have intervened in Libya, and how it has created a slave trade in Libya, has created all these refugees, which Gaddafi was kind of, keeping a very tight lock on. And, Libya under Gaddafi, it was, Lawrence Wilkerson says it was doing as well or even better than Israel was as far as as far as education, healthcare, and providing the welfare and benefits for people. It was the most prosperous country in the region. So Gaddafi was using his resources to benefit the people, and this was strongly in opposition to the interests of Western governments. And he wanted to have his currency traded in gold and not dollars. And there's some significant truth to that. And we talk about how Canada was instrumental in defeating a initiative brought about by South Africa to have a peaceful resolution to the conflict, which Gaddafi had agreed to. Gaddafi had agreed to allow the rebels to control a significant territory of Libya, and he would then control another portion of Libya. And this was agreed to by Gaddafi. Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister, Baird, comes in and he says, are you guys out of your mind? He says this to the Libyan rebels who've also expressed agreement with the South African Peace Initiative. Are you guys out of your mind? No, we're going in to get Gaddafi to kill him. We're going for the whole of Libya. There's not going to be any acceptance of any South African peace deal. So Canada was very instrumental in all of these conflicts, Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, and Libya. And we also touch on the current consequence of these horrendous conflicts, which is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And during the 5th episode, we briefly touch on that, where we actually go to the Monk School. The Monk School is holding a debate with John Mearsheimer for a leading proponent of the realist theory of international relations, Stephen Walt, and also a Polish politician and a significant individual, leading individual within the U.S. State Department. They're all having a debate, and the main issue is whether Russia's geopolitical interests should be taken into consideration in looking at this conflict. And we show you excerpts of that debate, and it's quite revealing. We also, throughout the docuseries, we also go and talk to individual Canadians, and we ask them, what are your thoughts on, Canada's foreign policy in Afghanistan and so on and so forth. And many of them are completely clueless. And as far as this Ukraine-Russia segment, we ask them, why do you think Russia has invaded Ukraine? And a lot of them say, it's because Putin wants to resurrect the Soviet Union again. But that's completely, that's what the media is telling them. And that's another thread that we have where we talk about the media and their role in refusing to take a critical look at Canada's foreign policy, thereby imposing this notion, this view on the population that Canada's this benevolent peacekeeping nation. And when we're talking about Russia, Ukraine, we really expose, John Mearsheimer really talks about how it was in fact NATO's expansion eastward right up to Russia's border that has resulted in Putin feeling threatened. It was the fact that the US has repeatedly tried to get Ukraine into NATO. In 2008, most notably, George W. Bush invites Ukraine to join NATO. And at the time that was rebuffed by Germany and France. And at the time, George Bush had said, Vladimir Putin had said to George Bush, if you're insistent on Ukraine joining NATO, we're going to take Crimea. And but the US just ignored that. So we kind of foreshadow this conflict. There's an interesting scene right after we discussed the Yugoslavia conflict. James Bissett, he foreshadows the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which is going to happen. He says if the West continues its provocative actions, we're looking at nuclear war here, and that right now we're very, we're very at a significant risk of having nuclear war. So long as
the clock is getting closer to the midnight, right, on the nuclear countdown.
That's right. Yeah, the doomsday clock. Yeah. The
doomsday clock.
Yeah.
That's right.
You're out there listening or watching or both to Green and Red podcast, and we're having a really fascinating discussion with Pitasanna Shanmugathas, who has the producer and director, I guess both, of Truth to the Powerless, an investigation into Canada's foreign policy, which is a 6-part documentary series. To kind of follow up on that, this is a little bit of a broader question. As somebody who studies U.S. foreign policy, I'm motivated by kind of 50, 60 years ago, a group of scholars, the New Left, I'm sure you're familiar with that, which really kind of changed the debate in the US from one that said, the US is idealistic and it's trying to bring democracy, or, the US is realistic. And the New Left put, in front the idea of kind of power and material interests. And obviously Canada isn't trying to gain global hegemony like the US, but I just wondered kind of what its interest and motives were. And maybe along with that, you could talk a little bit about its military budgets and weapons sales and things like that.
It's often talked about Canada's foreign policy to those that are kind of like critical of it. They just kind of dismiss Canada's foreign policy of Canada just being a puppet of the United States. But I think that's a very misleading way to look at Canada's foreign policy, because it is true. Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, who was also prime minister, once said, comparing the US-Canada relationship, he said that the United States is like the elephant and Canada is like a mouse. Every time the elephant stops, the mouse, it feels the reverberations, can feel every twitch. So, and that's characterizing Canada's relationship with the United States. Yes, we are very interconnected, but it's also very important to acknowledge that Canada has its own independent objectives, its own independent goals. So, for instance, when Canadian mining companies, when they're going into Latin America and when they're extracting resources and poisoning the ecosystem and expelling villagers, Canada's doing this. The Canadian government is allowing this without any accountability for mining companies like Barrick Gold. The reason is because it's extremely profitable. It's extremely lucrative to do that. And the reason why Canada, for instance, in our episode on Canada's involvement in Saudi Arabia, in selling arms to Saudi Arabia, while Saudi Arabia is using these arms, there's been credible allegations that Saudi Arabia is using Canadian arms in its involvement, its bombing, and its assault on Yemen. And so we interviewed Canada's last ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Dennis Horwath, and we asked him, there are these credible allegations that Canada's arms have been used to assault the population of Yemen by Saudi Arabia. And the Canadian ambassador to Saudi Arabia just says, does Canada want an arms industry or does it not? That's his response. And what he's saying is that the Canadian arms industry, it's an extremely lucrative. It provides a significant number of jobs, and we actually counter that assertion. We interview Richard Sanders, who is part of the coalition to oppose the arms trade, and we interview Richard Sanders, who's a strong opponent of Canada's arms industry. And Richard Sanders says, well, that's actually not true, because it will be more beneficial. You would create more jobs if the Canadian government had invested its money in the public sector in building roads, education, healthcare, housing. You'd create more jobs that way than you would through the arms industry. And we put up statistics to support this in the docuseries as well. So yes, Canada is significantly close to the United States. Yes, there's a strong bond there, but Canada does have its own personal interests. And the United States isn't telling Canada to, sell arms to the Saudis. We're doing that because it's very profitable. It's very lucrative. You generate a significant number of jobs. The United States isn't telling Canada to go into Latin America with your mining companies and devastate the villages and extract all those resources you can. We're doing that because it's very lucrative. It's a very profit maximizing initiative. The United States isn't telling Canada to support Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories, sell Israel arms, defend Israel tooth and nail. We're doing that because we're a settler colonial nation and we have a bond with Israel because both countries were founded on the expulsion of the indigenous population. So yes, there is a bond between Canada and the United States, but a lot of these initiatives, Canada's doing it because it's in our interests as far as capital, as far as profit is concerned. It's in the interest of the 1%, which Canada supports, to do that.
You know, there's an Australian academic named Clinton Fernandez who is actually a friend and comrade of the podcast. We've had him on several times. And he actually has just recently published a book called Sub-Imperial Power, where he's arguing that Australia plays the role as a sub-imperial power of first the British Empire and then the American Empire, where they are like they're policing a region. And in Australia's case, it's very much developing around like what's going on between China and Taiwan. It's around East Timor and the relationship with Indonesia. And I'm wondering if you see any sort of parallels where Canada plays this role as a sub-imperial power for the U.S. or the British in years past. And you're muted. You're muted, and you've been freezing a little bit too, just so you know.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Did you get that question?
Did it freeze?
I did.
Oh, good.
Okay, good. Okay. It's just you were totally frozen, so we just want to make sure.
Oh, okay. So there are instances where the United States relies on Canada as a junior partner to kind of do its dirty work. So one instance of this is Canada's intervention in Haiti to overthrow the democratic elected leader, Haiti's first democratically elected leader, Jean-Bertrand Aristide. So Canada, we're a francophone, French-speaking country. We have a significant French-speaking population. So to provide some historical context before I get into that, in terms of Haiti, Haiti had, in the early 1991, had elected its first democratic leader. His name was Jean-Bertrand Aristide. He was a Catholic priest. He was an individual who was a proponent of a liberation theology, and he had strong resonance among the poor people of Haiti. And he had campaigned on alleviating the miseries of the poor, so that the poor people of Haiti can have some semblance of dignity. He was not this radical socialist or anything like that. He just wanted to improve the Haitians' lifestyle just a little bit, just incrementally, so they can just have some semblance of dignity. Because Haiti was the first Black-led Black republic that had expelled its colonial occupier, France. And in return for expelling its colonial occupier, France, Haiti had to pay France for the property that France lost. The property that France lost was the Black Haitian population. The Black Haitian population, they were slaves to France. So France had imposed this huge multi-million-dollar debt on Haiti, which it took Haiti decades and decades and decades to pay back. And that was a core reason for Haiti's impoverishment. And the United States was consistently throughout the Cold War opposing any leader that would rise and would advocate for the rights of the poor. In comes Jean-Bertrand Aristide, 1991. He completely takes the United States by surprise. The United States has this Western-backed politician running for the election, Wall Street-backed Mark Bazin. The United States isn't even paying attention to the election, completely underestimates the election, and turns out Jean-Bertrand Aristide wins overwhelmingly. He's elected leader. Jean-Bertrand Aristide, he disbands the ruthless Haitian military that's been instrumental, trained by the United States to oppress dissent in Haiti. He disbands the military, and shortly thereafter, he's overthrown, and Jean-Bertrand Aristide flees to the United States. Jean-Bertrand Aristide then comes back to Haiti in return, acceding to U.S. demands to impose neoliberal programs that would devastate the Haitian poor. Jean, second term, in his first and second term, really, his party called the Lavalas Party. They build more schools during the time that his party's in power than in any other time in Haitian history. More schools are built, an increase in literacy rates. There are thousands of democratically elected officials, statewide, nationwide. This happens under the Lavalas Party, Jean-Bertrand Aristide's party. So in his second term in 2000, which is from 2000 to 2004, when he's overthrown, during that time, his second term, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, he makes a public appeal and he calls for France to pay reparations to Haiti because of the millions upon millions of dollars that Haiti had to pay France. France is then outraged about this. And now we know from the New York Times, there's a recent publication on the New York Times that French diplomats have said, we were relieved that the United States and its allies, Canada, they had played a role in removing Aristide because this took the pressure off from us having to pay reparations, because this was a sitting president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, telling France, pay us reparations for this ridiculous debt that you imposed on us. Jean-Bertrand Aristide, he also increased the minimum wage just slightly, but he did it in a manner that angered foreign, where uses black Haitians to make t-shirts in sweatshops. And so when Aristide had increased the minimum wage, this angered Guild and Activewear. So the reason why the Bush administration, Colin Powell mainly, was so adamant that Aristide had to go is because Aristide was setting a bad example. When you have somebody like Aristide, who is a leader of a poor country, and he significantly improves the literacy rate, the maternity rate, he significantly combats the HIV/AIDS epidemic in that country. He builds more schools, which allows children to become educated. When you have a leader in a poor country that sets that kind of example, it then will create a domino effect that will then affect some allies that the United States and Canada really cares about, like Mexico, for instance. It creates this domino effect across Latin America. Stop to that. You have to contain the virus. So the United States needed help in doing this. So the United States asked Canada, which has a significant French speaking population, and Bill Graham, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time, and David Pratt, who we interview. They provide assistance to Colin Powell, to the United States. Canadian peacekeeping forces secure the airport in which Jean-Bertrand Aristide is taken, kidnapped against his will, taken onto a plane that's been secured. The airport's been secured by Canadian forces, and Jean-Bertrand Aristide and his wife, they don't know where they're going there, and they get dumped in the Central African Republic. A UN peacekeeping force comes in, brutally tortures and represses the population. The Lavalas Party, all the elected officials, thousands of officials, were just wiped out. And there was this U.S.-backed leader that had taken over, Gerald Lertourtou, and he had then resumed this U.S. Western-led repression of Haiti. And so when I interview Bill Graham, when we were interviewing all these politicians for a docuseries, we never actually challenged any of the politicians we interviewed. We just interviewed them, wanted to get the establishment line, and then we would interview the activists and academics who would then challenge the establishment line. One exception to that was Bill Graham. I wanted to challenge Bill Graham on Haiti because Bill Graham was, Bill Graham was a huge figure in Canadian politics. Bill Graham had taken a lead on Canada's involvement in Yugoslavia. Bill Graham had taken a lead on Canada's supposed non-intervention in Iraq. Canada actually did support the 2003 Iraq War, although we said, we claimed we did not. We exposed this in the docuseries as well. Bill Graham was the decision maker in that area. Bill Graham then was a decision maker in Canada's involvement in Afghanistan and also Canada's involvement in Haiti to overthrow a democratic elected leader. So in all these areas, Bill Graham was kind of like Forrest Gump in all these important areas. He just happened to be there. So he was a significant, powerful individual. And the reason I felt that, nobody, he was in ill health. We had tried to get an interview with him for like a year and a half. And I was aware he was in ill health, and I figured that this would be the last time anybody would get a chance to challenge Bill Graham on his record on Haiti. We also challenged his record on Afghanistan as well, as I previously mentioned. But when I significantly challenged Bill Graham on his on Canada's intervention in Haiti, he characterized Aristide as a thug and a dictator, and he said that what Canada was doing was a good thing because we were restoring peace and stability. There was no bloodshed. Bill Graham consistently repeated that Canada's intervention was completely benevolent. When I told Bill Graham, what about the fact that France had imposed this huge debt on Haiti, and then he was totally dismissive of that. Would not, he was like, oh, I don't know about France. I don't know about any of that. He completely refused to acknowledge any alternative reality from the one that he believed, which was that Aristide was a thug, a dictator. We had to go in, we had to get him out. That was Bill Graham's reality. That was his frame of mind. So the entire premise of this docuseries is that you have to, the very first scene of the docuseries, Noam Chomsky, who we interview, is looking right into the camera, and he says, the people in power already know the truth. It's the powerless that don't. When I interviewed Bill Graham, he was the first person where I looked at him and it seemed like he genuinely believed everything he was saying. When the interview was finished with Bill Graham, the cameras are off, and he's just kind of exasperated because I grill him so much on Haiti. I talk, when I was interviewing him, I talk about that Aristide had, significantly improved the minimum wage, improved the health care, the lifestyle of the Haitian people, combating HIV, the AIDS epidemic, increasing the adult literacy rate, slightly increasing the minimum wage. Aristide would say, I did a lot of good things for the Haitian people. How could you call me a thug and a dictator? And then Bill Graham kind of says, well, I'm not saying it. I mean, I'm saying it, but I'm saying it because that's what Haitians Haitians have told me. And so that's this narrow view that he has. When the cameras are turned off, he's kind of exasperated, and he says, do you have any idea how hard it was for us to get him out of the country? Like, he's saying this as if we did Aristide a favor. We didn't kill you, but we got you out. And it just kind of boggled me for a little bit. But that was one instance where
the benevolent empire.
So another instance where Canada was like a junior ally to the United States is in the U.S. intervention in Iraq in 2003. So we interviewed Canada's ambassador to the United States. We interviewed Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. Canada's ambassador to the United States is Michael Kurgan. Canada's ambassador to the United Nations is Paul Heinbecker. We interviewed the defense minister as well, David Pratt and Bill Graham, and we get all these. We get the establishment perspective, which is that Canada opposed the U.S. war in Iraq. Our establishment line was that you do not have a UN Security Council resolution. So because of that, we can't go into Iraq. That was Canada's line. But secretly, covertly, Canada, we exposed in the docuseries, Canada had major generals, 3 major generals coordinating the U.S. Bombing missions in Iraq. Canada was providing weapons to the United States, which were being used in Iraq. Canada was allowing U.S. aircraft to enter into Canadian airspace en route to bomb Iraq. So we were providing the air support. So the United States could not have launched a successful assault on Iraq had it not been for the covert Canadian support. And in the docuseries, we talk about how Canada is boasting in the United States, is privately boasting to U.S. officials about how Canada is doing the most to contribute to the U.S. invasion in Iraq outside of the public coalition of the willing nations. Outside of the coalition of the willing nations, Canada is privately boasting to the United States, we're doing so much to help you. So that's just another instance of Canada acting as a junior ally to the United States.
Yeah, we're getting close to time here. So again, thanks so much for being here with us on Green and Red. And I told you a minute ago I was going to ask you about Ukraine, but I've actually changed. And I'm just curious, like what the reception has been, distribution reception to this docuseries. Have a lot of people seen it? How can people see it? And what kind of response have you gotten? Is this kind of informative and eye-opening to a lot of people?
Yeah, so this docuseries is free to watch for anybody who wants to watch it anywhere around the world. We've put it out free. The reason being is we want this docuseries to be like an educational resource for people who are genuinely curious about Canada's foreign policy, but don't know where to look, don't know where to start, don't have the time to research. People are very busy, 40-hour, work weeks. People don't have time. So this docuseries, it's a free resource. truthtothepowerless.com. That's where you can go to watch the 6-part docuseries. And the reception we've got from this docuseries has been overwhelmingly positive. A lot of people have been kind of amazed at how we've been able to put this docuseries together, getting the politicians' establishment perspective as well as the dissident, the activist academic perspective. And a lot of people have characterized this docuseries as being very groundbreaking, informative. There's been no other docuseries in Canadian history that interviews both the politicians as well as the dissidents and academics. This is the first in Canada's history that has done this, and a lot of people have praised us for that.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, I study U.S. foreign policy, allegedly an expert, and there's just so much in this that I've learned. So I would, recommend it certainly, especially because, we started by saying here in the United States, we have this really particular view of Canada. It's really, kind of on a pedestal, and it's a very pristine and benevolent. And the reality is that it is kind of like any other big country with capitalist interest and energy interests and weapons sales and everything else. So thanks so much. This is really great.
My final question was, you touched on some of it already, but just the sort of like corporate angle. You've talked about Barrick Gold a lot, and they're involved in mining projects, particularly in the global majority countries like in Africa and Latin America. But then the question I wanted to ask you is that also the Canadian finance sector is very involved in funding a lot of fossil fuel projects, both in Canada and then other parts of the world. Banks like Royal Bank of Canada and Toronto Dominion. And I'm just wondering if you had looked into any sort of connection between some of the what's it called, Bay Street, I think is the Wall Street of Toronto, of Canada. I wonder if you've been seeing any sort of connection between Bay Street and some of the foreign policy adventures.
One of the most revealing things that I had learned during my investigation into Canada's foreign policy is how the Canadian pension plan, the Canadian citizens, our pension money is being used to invest in some of the most rapacious, profit maximizing, horrendous companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, like oil companies, all these weapons companies, just some of the most atrocious companies. Our pension money is being used to invest in these companies. So we're all complicit in all these atrocities that are going on with all these companies, and companies like Toronto Dominion, Royal Bank. They've often significantly played a role in oppressing Latin America, the third world. Their financial interests are very strongly linked in terms of controlling the resources of those countries. And Yves Englert actually does a great job in his book, The Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy, about actually documenting, going back all the way to the early 1900s and talking about how Canada, Canadian banks had a role in Latin America in terms of suppressing any form of ability for Latin Americans to take control of their own resources, but we don't actually explore that in this docuseries. But we do talk about one of the most interesting revelations is the Canadian pension plan, and how we list out all these profit maximizing corporations where our money's been invested, and we also link to, I didn't mention this, but it's also very important, Canada's involvement in supporting Indonesia's invasion and occupation of East Timor. And that was a huge, Canada saw Indonesia as a significant partner in the global South, a significant source for investment, for Canada's development money to go into, because Canada had mining interests in Indonesia, and so it did not bode well for Pierre Trudeau, who was who was Canada's leader at the time, to take a critical stance towards Indonesia's occupation of East Timor. So Canada supplied weapons to Indonesia. Canada consistently rejected diplomatic efforts for calling for Indonesia's withdrawal from East Timor, and a quarter of the population, Indonesia had slaughtered a quarter of the population, the worst atrocity post-World War II, and Canada was fully supportive of that, right up until the very end in the early 2000s.
Yeah, just brutal, bloody situation. Folks, you've been listening to Pitasanna Shanmugathas, who's made a docuseries called Truth to Powerlessness, an investigation into Canada's foreign policy. We'll actually have in the show notes, we'll actually have links to the docuseries. If you like what you're hearing, check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you're watching this on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button. And if you want to make a donation, go to greenandredpodcast.org and hit the support button, or check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. Pitasanna, it's been great talking with you today. This has been pretty important work that you've done, and we're very flattered that you made contact with us and allowed us to put this out to our audience. So much appreciation.
Thanks again for having me. I'm honored to be on your show. You guys discuss very important issues, so thanks again for having me.
Yeah, and everyone else out there, make trouble and misbehave, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Special planet ruby rich, fucking change the beat. I'm a Gustafson, now cheap ass parade of dinnerweights and commissars and bricks. Drown out this Venus later, coming faggot heretics. The nail that sticks up gets hammered down. The master's finest, his finest tools are found. Slack jaw, placid, a missing cacophony of screaming billboards and Disney-fied history. Sometimes the ties that bind are strange. No justice shines upon the cemetery plots marked Hampton Weaver or anime, where federal customary gap we find between history and true founding fathers. Back in the rocket's blinding red glare, the bomb bursting in air, one nation indivisible. But the truth is, the backcountry learned of ratification, the people out of coffin painted black, solemnly born in funeral procession, they buried in deep